Hello and welcome to the Weekly Huddle podcast. My name is Christian and I will be your host for today, and we will be going over our Week 1 USFL Power Rankings. The USFL made its return this past weekend, and it is now time to discuss some of the teams that we believe started off their season strong, and some of the teams that are going to need a bit of work before heading into their Week 2 matchups. To start off our Power Rankings, taking up our 8th and last spot, we have the Houston Gamblers. The Houston Gamblers come off the 2022 season with a 3-7 record and high hopes that next season would follow a different path. Unfortunately, we are not off to a great start, as we start off with a 13-29 loss to the Michigan Panthers. Although maybe not the start of the game they would have wanted, with their first drive ending in a punt and immediately letting up a 7-play, 80-yard touchdown drive, the Gamblers came back, capitalizing on a touchdown, holding the Michigan Panthers off to a field goal, and capitalizing off of some Michigan Panthers mistakes to allow for yet another touchdown, gaining a 13-9 lead over Michigan. Unfortunately, this is where the Houston Gamblers' success would end, as constant mistakes to disappointing drives would allow for the Michigan Panthers to command to a 29-13 win over Houston. Starting on the offensive side of the ball, quarterback Bahar had a disappointing start to his season, going 13 for 22 for 109 yards, 0 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions with a final QBR of 34.1. Although they had 8 different pass catchers on the day, they weren't really able to get anything going, as nobody had more than 2 catches and nobody had more than 23 yards. On the ground, they had Pledger leading the way with 16 attempts for 41 yards, an average of 2.6 yards per carry. He was able to punch it through with 2 touchdowns on the day, scoring the only touchdowns for his team. So they have a running back and they have a running game that can punch it in once they get close to the end zone, once they get to that 5-yard and closer mark. Unfortunately, you have to be able to get there to do that, which they were not able to do many times this game. Things didn't look too bright on the defensive side of the ball either. Although they were able to get 6 tackles for loss with 2 sacks, which meant that they were getting some level of production on the defensive side of the ball, it didn't really matter because the secondary was getting torched throughout the entire game, thanks to a historic performance from the Michigan Panthers. And even though they were able to get some meaningful stops in the second and early third quarters, which kept them in the game for a long time, it ended up not really mattering all too much. As soon as the interception was thrown in the third quarter, things kind of looked down from there, as it was touchdown after touchdown after touchdown from the Panthers, and both the Gamblers' offense and defense could not come up with an answer. It was kind of unfortunate that Jaguars head coach Doug Peterson decided to show up to this game, of all games, because it was definitely not the showing that he was looking for, I feel. But the Gamblers are going to look to regroup and hopefully improve next week. But for now, they will remain at the bottom of our rankings. If the Gamblers are looking to move up next week with their Week 2 matchup of the New Orleans Breakers, they're going to have to improve on both sides of the ball, as they're going to need better QB play from Bahar. They're going to have to not give up 300 yards of offense with a secondary that is definitely going to have a tough time covering a quarterback who just threw for 300 yards on his own. And they're going to have to clean up some of their messy drives. Their mistakes that they had at the end of the game, their 3-and-outs that they had, they're going to have to just put together a more well-rounded team. They have to be able to play a full game of football. They have to be able to stay with it throughout the entire 4 quarters. Not just in the first quarter, not just in the second quarter, but the entire game. Next up in our power rankings, coming in at our number 7 spot, we have the Pittsburgh Maulers. On the bright side, the Maulers were able to keep it close the entire game and had a shot to win, all the way up until the final drive. This unfortunately doesn't mean that they played a great or good or even okay game. On the offensive side of the ball, starting with the quarterbacks, Morgan and Williams combined for a 10-27, 81-yard and 0 touchdown performance that left a lot to be desired in the passing game. Completing only 10 completions the entire game for 81 yards isn't necessarily what you want to see out of your season opener. Speaking of receiving, their receivers, all 3 of them that had hauled in a pass, weren't getting much done. The longest pass of the day was 23 yards, and besides that, no one was really getting much production. Nothing was getting done on the ground either, as they had 1 rush that went for 31 yards from Gary, but besides that, nothing was really happening. They had 5 different rushers, none of them accumulated more than 35 yards, and not much to show for it, as none of them had any touchdowns on the day. I think the biggest question mark of this offense, however, is the offensive line, as they were getting harassed constantly throughout the entire game. Every single drive, you were seeing pressure after pressure, and on every single 3 and out, something had to happen where the breakers were able to get through, disrupt plays, and allow for nothing, basically, to get done on the Maulers' offensive side. You can even look at the results of each drive and just tell what kind of game this was. They started off drive 1, the beginning of the game, with a field goal, then a punt, then second quarter a punt, and another punt, and a blocked field goal. And in the third quarter, another punt, and in the fourth quarter, a turnover on downs, and guess what? Another turnover on downs. Absolutely nothing was being produced by this Pittsburgh offense. In fact, if it wasn't for their 1 defensive touchdown and their 1 punt return that came back for a touchdown, then they wouldn't have any touchdowns on the game. All of their touchdowns came from defense or special teams, none of them coming from offense. The offense only able to produce 3 points on the entire day, and it came in the very first drive. So, you had 1 drive where you could produce 3 points, and the entire rest of the game, you gave nothing on the field. The reason we have the Maulers at 7th and are keeping the Gamblers in 8th place in our power rankings, though, is because everyone else was able to produce in some way with the offensive faults. Although nothing was getting done on the offensive side of the ball, on defense they were able to produce a touchdown and had a lot of the same defensive line success as the Breakers, and even had success on special teams with the punt return for a touchdown in the fourth quarter. There is some upside to this Maulers team, especially with defensive standout Reuben Foster, who had 12 tackles and the forced fumble that led to one of the Maulers' only touchdowns, and he is going to be a player to watch this entire USFL season. But it takes more than 1 defensive standout to win football games, and they're going to have to address their problems on offense if they're going to want to improve in the following weeks. Next up, coming in at our 6th spot in our power rankings, we're going to have the New Jersey Generals. The Generals are a team that had their fair share of ups and downs in their Week 1 matchup versus the Stallions, and although Birmingham in Week 1 is a very difficult matchup, that doesn't exclude the Generals from their own criticisms. The defense to start just could not find its footing, and although they had some success in defending the run, they really couldn't get it done against the Stallions offense, who seemed to be able to put up numbers and drive down the field in every quarter of the game. On the offensive side of the ball, the passing game left a lot of Generals fans scratching their heads as DeAndre Johnson returned to the USFL to only pass 4 for 13 for 29 yards and a QBR of 40.2. Prukup, on the other hand, had a bit more success, passing 13 for 17 for 148 yards, yet still no touchdowns in the air. The upside of this team, however, comes from their rushing attack, with Victor having 8 attempts for 89 yards on an average of 11.1, DeAndre Johnson contributing 7 rushes for 45 yards, and Prukup having our only touchdown of the day for the Generals on the ground with 4 rushes for 12 yards and our touchdown. I think from the creative play calling to the athletes that this team has to execute, this team, especially the ground game, is one that I'm looking forward to seeing in the coming weeks, and I believe that this number 6 spot is a noticeable jump ahead of our 7 and 8 teams, although a rushing game is not going to get you to move past some of the top teams in this league, especially our Birmingham Stallions. I do believe, however, that the Generals are going to take some time to regroup and hopefully gain some momentum ahead of their Week 2 matchup against the Maulers. From here, taking up our 5th spot in the last team to have a losing record on the season thus far, we have the Memphis Showboats. Memphis had a very solid showing against the Philadelphia Stars in their Week 1 matchup, with one of their bright spots being their D-line. Whether it was outside linebacker Greg Rivas or defensive end Jordan Williams, someone was constantly applying pressure and getting through this Philadelphia offensive line. A defensive effort done so well in the trenches that pressure and sacks were still getting accumulated, even with only rushing 3 pass rushes. Unfortunately for the Showboats, the Stars had such a good start to their game, with their first 3 drives all ending in a touchdown, that even despite their defensive efforts improving as the game continued, forcing 3 punts and a blocked field goal, it didn't really matter, as the offense wasn't able to score more points and the team wasn't able to pull out with a victory. Speaking of the offense, starting off with quarterback White, who went 16 for 29 for 182 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception for a QBR of 82.8. Honestly, a pretty solid day for the quarterback, although even the announcers were mentioning that there needs to be some improvement going through your reads. Oftentimes, wide receivers would be left open underneath or on shallow out routes where you would have a solid completion and you would keep the drive going, but oftentimes White would opt for either a deep ball or a pass that really just wasn't there, and a lot of times on those deep balls we saw some inaccuracies. We saw some high sailing balls and things that some of these shorter receivers can't really climb the ladder to catch. So there's going to have to be some improvement in the quarterback play, although I believe they're in a much better position starting off week 1 than all of the rest of the teams mentioned thus far. It's nice to see a quarterback in White who's willing to lower the shoulder and fight for those extra yards, although I would not wish to see him get injured. And it's also nice to see their wide receivers doing a very good job of running their routes and getting open. I would like to see better pass protection, though, more specifically from their tight ends and running backs. There was one play in particular I remember the tight end almost single-handedly caused an interception with a whiffed pass block, which almost left to the defense making a play. So some improvements there. The O-line had its fair share of ups and downs, but overall was decent to say the least. And when given the opportunity from his O-line, Collins had a pretty solid day. 14 attempts for 63 yards and a touchdown, and he is definitely going to be someone that I am looking forward to watching in the coming weeks. Overall, this is a team that I'm very much looking forward to seeing, and a team that I think could make some strides in the coming weeks. Although there were some mistakes, like overlooking Rashard Davis, who was open underneath, they do have a lot of key pieces on defense that are looking to wreak havoc on some of these weaker O-lines, and this is a team that I'm excited for. This is a team that I'm optimistic about, and this is a team that I think could do well in the coming weeks as long as they get their footing and they're able to keep it pushing one drive at a time. Next up in our power rankings, in our first 1-0 team on the list, we have in the number 4 spot, the New Orleans Breakers. The Breakers are a team that, to me, could go either way in the coming weeks. We saw some very good things from them, and we saw some very not so good things. Starting with the good things, quarterback Bethel Thompson had a great day with going 23 for 41 for 302 yards and a touchdown. QBR was 87.7, but the only quarterback to throw over 300 yards has to be noted for something. He had wide receivers that were able to get some very solid production, and a defense whose secondary showed up getting 7 passes defended, which I believe is the most out of any team in week 1. This team does need to get better at finishing drives, as although it is a positive to say that you have a special teams, especially a kicker that you can rely on well, it's not a great thing to say that you had to rely on him for an entire game. I get that it's the first week and it's not the right time to make assumptions, but if things keep going like this and your only touchdown is going to come from the 4th quarter and all of your other points are going to come from your kicker, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to keep up with a lot of the top teams in this league. One thing that definitely needs to be improved from this Breaker squad is their offensive line. They let up 4 sacks to the Maulers and really had no running game to show for their efforts either, as their top rusher was Jones with 19 attempts for only 46 yards, an average of 2.4, which even though it is week 1 and these things can be improved, they're going to have to be improved, as a lackluster running game and a below average offensive line are not makings for teams that are going to be able to compete with the best of the best, for teams that are going to be able to go for that championship run. So they have their homework to do, they have some improvements to make, and whether or not this team rises or falls in the following weeks is still yet to be determined. I think for this team I hold a cautious optimism, and although I do think that they can make some improvements and I'm looking forward to seeing them, I need to see it to believe it. And with that, we will jump to our number 3 team, which we have our Michigan Panthers. I think Michigan was the team that I found difficult to place the most, as they had a fantastic day. They had a historic quarterback performance and a defensive player that is already garnering talks for defensive player of both the week and potentially of the season if he keeps it up. But unfortunately, their competition was so low that I don't know if I can put them in that number 2 spot just yet. Starting with the offense, there is not much that needs to be said about quarterback Love's performance. 18 for 20, 215 yards, 3 touchdowns, QBR of 151. He had a fantastic day. And that is my biggest draw to this Michigan team, is the fact that they had a consistent, solid, and scoring pass thrower. They got a guy who can march down the field, and they got a guy who can deliver passes accurately. They got a guy who can go down and score. And arguably, he's one of the best quarterbacks that we've seen thus far in the league. Sure, he's not going to be someone that's going to be your dual threat QB that'll rush for 20 yards and pass for another 50 on every drive, but he doesn't need to be. You have Scott on the running game, who went for 12 attempts for 61 yards and a touchdown, a 5.1 average, which is definitely one of the better averages of any running back so far. And on the receiving end, you have very good wide receivers. You have Walker, who had a very impressive performance of 6 receptions for 105 yards and a touchdown, and every single pass catcher except for one had at least one catch that was 10 plus yards. An offensive effort that was met by their defense, with Speaks being that dude. Speaks is someone that I'm going to be watching very closely throughout the entirety of this season, because he is someone that is exciting to watch. He is someone that I'm looking forward to seeing terrorize these offensive lines, especially because this entire first week we haven't seen great O-line play, and this is a guy that's going to take heavy advantage of that. And that's not to discredit the rest of the defense. With 4 sacks, 3 tackles for loss, 2 interceptions, they had a very good day. My only issue is that they didn't face better talent. They faced who, in my opinion, was the worst team in the league in week 1, and I just don't know if they're going to be able to replicate in weeks to come. I think they will, and I hope that they will, but I really need to watch and see. This Michigan team is extremely fun to watch and is going to be one that I think everybody should keep an eye on for the coming weeks. I just hope that they're able to keep up this level of production against higher level talent. Speaking of higher level, as we move on to our number 2 spot, we introduce the Philadelphia Stars. The Stars had a solid matchup against the Showboats and did not disappoint, coming out of the gate with their first 3 drives all ending in touchdowns. Although I do have some concern in their lack of keeping it going throughout the 4th quarter, as we didn't see any scoring from Philadelphia in the 4th, their ability to come out hot and to stay hot through 3 quarters of football was impressive, especially being that they had a very well-rounded team. Cookus did a fantastic job with one of the better quarterback performances of the week, going 20 for 29 for 212 yards and 3 touchdowns, a QBR of 124.5 with no interceptions, not to mention he was the team's leading rusher, going 7 attempts for 31 yards. Although this does bring up one of my biggest complaints with this team, being that they don't have a true rushing attack. Being able to have a quarterback that can do it both, deliver the ball well in the air, as well as provide a threat with his legs, is something that will not be taken for granted by opposing defensive coordinators. And with Gray snapping ankles, with Roland being a fine gadget player and a great returnman, the wide receivers were doing their job very well too. The defense came out swinging as well. They had a disruptive front 7 to start off the game. They had players making plays like number 58 and Worthington, defensive back number 20. And although the stat sheet doesn't necessarily say it, the production that they were having, especially on the defensive front applying pressure to the Showboats, was effective, and they did a very good job. My biggest complaint with this team, however, comes from their blocking. First off, from their special teams blocking, as all of the penalties from kick returns or from the blocked kicks that they saw on extra points or field goals, for whatever reason, they just are not able to block for kicks. I'm not sure what it was. I'm not sure if it was a week 1 fluke, but that definitely has to change in the future. And my second issue with blocking is their right side of their offensive line. I say specifically their right side. Mostly tackle number 74. He was letting 3-man pressures get through. He was, anytime that they ran to the right side, it looked like it was getting snuffed and nothing was really happening. If they ran it to the left, they were getting some decent plays out of it. The running game didn't look great altogether, but when they ran to the left, you saw a noticeable difference compared to when they ran to the right. It was the same in pass protection as well, with the left side of that offensive line looking solid, holding strong, pass and run alike, besides some mistakes here and there, which are going to happen. But on that right side, it was constant constant pressure and mistakes. Even on 3-man pressures, it seemed like sacks were getting through, it seemed like players were getting into the backfield, and you think, why is this happening? This shouldn't be happening. They're rushing 3 guys. This is a 3v5 scenario. We should win every time. When that's not the case, when number 74 is on the field, letting their edge rushers get through every single time. Again, even besides these glaring weaknesses that teams can, and I believe will, try to capitalize on, they were able to pull through, and they were able to take a strong victory over the Memphis Showboats. This team's ability, though, to push forward through these adversities and to put out a solid performance against a pretty good Memphis team is the reason why I have them in our second place ranking. With Cookus continuing to cook throughout the season, and with wide receivers and defensive backs and defensive line that's willing to go out and make plays and do a good job at doing their job, this is a team that we're looking forward to seeing. I think that they're a very good team, and as long as they address some of these glaring issues with blocking, they'll be able to go out and really wreak havoc on this league and make a strong case for the championship. Speaking of championship, our last and final team, our number 1 ranked team after week 1, is the Stallions. I know the Stallions coming in at the number 1 spot in week 1 is such a shocker to many of you, as nobody else has them ranked number 1. It's not like everyone reached to this conclusion out of thin air. The Stallions proved that they were coming back just as strong as they left off last season. From their 2 very solid quarterback performances to their defense that only let up 1 touchdown and multiple turnovers throughout the game, this is a very strong team, and one that people are going to be looking to dethrone as the time passes. If there's any team that I look for to be undefeated for the longest, I believe it's going to be the Stallions. Will they stay undefeated the entire season? I don't think so. I believe that there are still some question marks to be answered, just like with every other team. But I think that this is the most complete, this is the most professional looking, and this is the team that teams are going to be looking at. They are going to say, listen, if we are going to want to get a shot at that title, we're going to have to get through the Stallions. If they can clean up some of their mistakes, and not to diss the Generals, but if they can provide strong outings against some of these other more complete teams, then I really believe that we may see back-to-back USFL champions. Now, is it way too early to be making a statement like that, or am I hitting the nail right on the head with my predictions and my analysis of these teams thus far after their week 1 matchups? Let me know in the comments. Let me know where you think I got it wrong and where you think I got it right, and what you're looking forward to seeing in their week 2 matchups. I'll be watching, and I hope you will be too. This has been Christian Tabor in our week 1 USFL Power Rankings. Looking forward to seeing you all next week. Take care.